Hey everyone, this is James here, and this is my HPG Axis in Men presentation. So starting with the structures and roles, the hypothalamus will secrete gonadotropin releasing hormone, similar to females, and they'll do it in a rapid or a slow pulse method, which preferences FSH or LH, depending on the pulsatility. Uh, If it is more rapid, that preference is LH or luteinizing hormone, and then more slowly, that preference is follicle stimulating hormone or FSH. As the GnRH moves through the hypophyseal portal system to the gonadotrope cells in the anterior pituitary, again, it'll depending on how its pulsatility, it will synthesize and release or lead to the synthesis and production of FSH and LH, which in turn they enter the systemic circulation, make their way to the testes, and the FSH preferences the Sertoli cells, and the LH preferences the Leydig cells. In the Leydig cells, LH aids in the production of testosterone, which is called test, DHT or dihydrotestosterone, and estradiol, which is called estra down here. The estradiol and DHT are in minimal amounts. The majority of what is being synthesized in the Leydig cells is testosterone. These Sertoli cells will produce inhibin and androgen binding protein, which is just ABP. ABP helps shuttle the testosterone that is produced in the Leydig cells over to the Sertoli cells, and the inhibin moves back to the anterior pituitary to inhibit the production of FSH. The testosterone, DHT, and estradiol works its negative feedback mechanism by inhibiting the production of FSH and LH at the anterior pituitary and at the hypothalamus, inhibiting the production of GnRH. So this negative feedback mechanism is how HPG homeostasis is maintained. This is the male testicle. On the left side is a cross section looking at the seminiferous tubules, all these yellow like squiggly lines. And then this photo on the right is a cross section of one of these seminiferous tubes, as you can see, but it's uh, as if we were looking at it from this direction. So the circle is here, and then right now we're looking inside the hole. Just to orient ourselves, these brown cells around the seminiferous tubules are the Leydig cells, and these purple cells inside of the lumen are the Sertoli cells. And then the little blue balls in between the Sertoli cells are the germ cells, with the sperm cell ultimately uh, extending out into the lumen. So within again, the Leydig cells produce testosterone, DHT, and estradiol. And these all, again, feed back to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. The ABP produced by the Sertoli cells helps shuttle testosterone through these membranes to help mature and grow these germ cells ultimately into sperm. Just make sure we hit everything. Yeah. So when we're looking at um, training load's effect on the HPG axis. Ultimately, we're going to look at testosterone production. And in a meta-analysis of 48 studies totaling 569 subjects, D'Andrea et al. Found that physical activity increased total testosterone. They found a standard mean difference of 0.74 nanomoles per liter, with a 95% confidence interval of 0.56 to 0.91 nanomoles per liter. They also found serum and saliva testosterone was increased after moderate and high intensity resistance and endurance training, but not mild. Additionally, they found that testosterone was increased 30 minutes within 30 minutes, but not after 30 minutes, which this makes sense if we use our understanding of intensity, volume, and sorry, intensity and volume on the duration of training. The higher, more intense that we are, the less likely we are to be able to sustain that over time. Obviously, resistance training is slightly different, given that there's rest periods. But in endurance training, the more intense that you train, the less likely you're going to sustain that over time. So it makes sense that we have a increase in testosterone with with higher intensities and less time, whereas these sub-maximal intensities or mild intensities, which tend to train longer, right, longer than 30 minutes, do not have changes in serum testosterone. Changes in basal levels as a result of chronic training, they're not likely to um, occur given the evidence. At Humar et al., they did a um, training study over the course of 14 weeks and saw no changes in plasma testosterone. The authors here, they had 3 days per week at first with the 30-minute sessions, and then they progressed that to 4 days per week with 45-minute sessions. And they saw that, again, there was no change in plasma testosterone, but changes in insulin sensitivity, plasma. Sorry, let me go back. The changes in insulin sensitivity and plasma HDL were increases, and then the changes in plasma triglyceride and adiposity were decreases. Again, both or all of these findings were at a point zero 0.05 p-value. White et al., they performed a endurance training study, which totaled 6 miles on week one, and then they doubled the volume with 12 miles in week two, but they maintained the same intensity. And then over the course of 2 weeks, they saw no changes in testosterone. And then in Nicholas et al., they performed a heavy progressive overload, heavy resistance training plan evaluated over the course of 16 weeks and saw increases in strength, specifically 37% in upper body and then 39% in lower body strength. And then the changes in lean body mass were 26.1 plus or minus 1.5%. So here, just very evident physiological changes, but there was no changes in serum testosterone. So less likely that over the course of time, or over chronic training plans, that there will be changes in basal levels, but it could be dependent. That there's nothing solidified in this. I couldn't find really intensity specific, right? Because if we go off of acute changes, we know that intensity kind of drives that testosterone adaptation. So maybe it's possible that uh, maybe training plans that are more intense can induce basal changes. Because if we're looking at here, like 30 minutes and then 45 minutes, we know there's not going to be any acute changes in 45 minutes. So, and maybe these 30 minutes, maybe there wasn't any acute changes because it was submaximal, mild, maybe. They didn't really specify. So it's possible that, again, this Humart et al. Study, um, there were no acute changes to begin with, so it didn't stimulate any, chronic changes. But that's just something to consider when we're looking at these basal shifts. And then risk and outcomes associated with anabolic steroid misuse. Um, a lot of it focuses on the sorry, cardiovascular changes, which Ding et al. They had found that 33% to 66% of premature deaths, uh, yeah, premature deaths. Sorry, I was going to draw like a skull or like, but like, let's just do that as premature deaths, um, are related to cardiovascular events, and everything else is hepatotoxic. And I mean, infertility doesn't lead to death, but all these other issues, cognitive issues, and then you can throw suicide down here as well. Suicide down here. Um, Everything else accounts for the other percentages. Um, we're looking here, thrombotic events, we have myocardial infarctions, ventricular hypertrophy with fibrosis, and this would have been, I'm going to say AAS for anabolic androgenic steroids. That's the synthetic steroid name. But this ventricular and hypertrophy and fibrosis was in AAS users, but without the um, cardiovascular adaptation that comes from like endurance training. So these are resistance individuals that were seen at death. They were evaluated and saw that their hearts had ventricular hypertrophy, but also fibrotic tissue in there as well. The hepatotoxicity uh, is essentially derived from these AASs because they're man-made. They're made to bypass liver metabolism on first bypass, and this first bypass leads to it inhibits the respiratory chain 1 and 3, which leads to an increase in reactive oxidative species, ultimately leading to cell apoptosis. Um, but if you think about it, right, we're injecting steroids intramuscularly, and so it's got to, right, as it goes through the muscle, it's got to enter the systemic circulation before it get to the heart, goes to the liver for metabolism. But as it moves through the liver, it's not being metabolized like a normal endogenous testosterone or yeah, testosterone or any normal steroid. Um, these kind of make that bypass through the hepatocytes, and this kind of leads to hepatocyte death. Um, and then infertility, the exogenous administration of AAS, uh, depending on the type, if it is a testosterone or the more potent DHT. This again, this all feeds back to the hypothalamus to inhibit the production of um, GnRH, and then at the pituitary, the LH and the FSH. And inhibiting those two things reduces natural um, Leydig cell and Leydig cell testosterone production. Thus, there's no transfer of testosterone into the Sertoli cells to help with germ maturation and sperm maturation, leading to that infertility. And then cognitive issues. Um, uh, Bertozzi et al., they had found that individuals who were AAS users compared to non-AAS users had thinner cerebral cortexes, brain stems, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and amygdalas. And then they also scored higher. They had higher scores on the Young Mania rating scale compared to non-A users, and that p-value was 0.002. And then they also found that 16% of the people evaluated with the forgot to put scale here, with the Young scale were hypomania. So this mania, hypomania kind of, I'd say going back and forth is kind of what we'd all know as roid rage. It leads to that. It's not what leads to it specifically, but it aids in that aggression via what we all know as roid rage. Um, Overall, in an analysis of these AAS users, mortality rates are 3 times higher, and that was at they're 3 times higher than compared to controls, and that was on a 95%. This is all in Bertozzi, by the way. That was a 95% confidence interval of 1.3 to 7. So some a lot of fluctuation there. But that makes, anabolic androgenic steroid use extremely dangerous, no matter the supraphysiological benefits that do occur. Here are all the references that I used for this presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Let me know if you have